The smoke was thick, swirling around like a nightmare. Inside the burning building there was no sound except for the distant crackle of flames, the screams of panic fading away. But then, through the haze, a shape emerged, strong, determined, and loyal. It was a dog. Its coat singed at the edges but unwavering in its mission. The fire had consumed everything in its path. But the dog's instincts were clear. A child was still trapped inside. It lunged forward through the flames, its eyes focused and fearless. The heat was unbearable, but the dog pressed on. It could hear the child's cries. It was more than just a rescue. It was a promise. As the dog reached the child, there was a flash, a sharp burst of light. A sudden explosion shook the building and the dog was thrown back, its body slamming against the wall. The child was safe. But what about the dog? The image of the hero dog, battered and covered in ash, was burned into the minds of everyone who witnessed it. But what happened next would leave everyone questioning. Did the dog survive? Or had this courageous act come at a price too high to pay? The hospital room was sterile, with bright white walls, and the sharp scent of antiseptic in the air. The dog lay on the floor, its fur matted with ash, and its body exhausted, but still full of life. The child it had saved had been rushed away to the emergency room, cared for by medical staff. The dog's job in many ways had been completed, but now, in the quiet aftermath, it was clear the world had shifted. The veteran entered the room, moving slowly, his body stiff. He had been through war zones, witnessed unimaginable destruction, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The dog's eyes, once filled with recognition and affection, now seemed distant. The bond they had shared, years of partnership, loyalty, and unspoken understanding, felt as if it had dissolved in the heat of the flames. The veteran stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking. He called out the dog's name, the name they had whispered countless times on missions, in the heat of battle and in the solitude of their shared space. "Charlie," he said, his voice hoarse. The dog's tail gave a small, uncertain twitch, but it did not move. There was no rush, no excitement, no recognition in its eyes. It simply stared back at him, head slightly tilted, as if trying to make sense of who this man was. The veteran stepped closer, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out. His fingers brushed against the dog's fur, but Charlie didn't flinch or lean into the touch as he had before. Instead, the dog pulled away, as if the touch were unfamiliar, like the hand of a stranger. The room was filled with remnants of their shared past. A worn leash, tangled in the corner, had been used countless times during their patrols. A faded collar, its tag worn from years of use, lay discarded on the floor next to Charlie. These small, once cherished objects seemed to scream out for the connection that was slipping away, and yet nothing bridged the growing gap between them. The veteran's chest tightened as he knelt down beside the dog, his fingers brushing against the collar and picking it up gently. It felt heavy, much heavier than he remembered. "It is me, buddy," he said quietly, though the words seemed to hang in the air, lost in the space between them. Charlie's eyes wandered around the room, his gaze darting to the door and to the unfamiliar surroundings. The veteran could see the confusion in his eyes, the uncertainty. He felt a stab of pain, realizing that the dog, once his loyal companion, no longer recognized him. Was it the trauma of the fire? The pain from his own injuries? Or had the bond they had shared truly been severed? The veteran sat slowly, his back resting against the wall. His hand dropped to his side, the collar still clutched tightly. "You do not remember me, do you?" he murmured, the weight of the question heavy between them. Charlie's ears flicked, but he did not move closer. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. For a moment, the veteran allowed himself to breathe, to take in the overwhelming loss. It was not just the dog that was distant now. It was him as well. The memories of battles fought, of shared moments of peace amidst chaos, and of walking together through the darkest hours all seemed so far away. Had the years they had spent together, the bond they had forged, meant nothing in the face of this new reality? Charlie, too, seemed adrift. The trauma of the fire had taken its toll on him just as much as it had on the veteran. The dog had been a protector, a partner in ways that words could never fully capture. But now, the very foundation of their bond seemed fractured. The veteran's heart ached as he realized that without the dog's recognition, he felt even more isolated. What was at stake here was not just the recognition of a long-lost bond, it was the healing of both souls, two beings who had given everything to each other, only to find themselves lost in the aftermath of the battle. Without Charlie, the veteran felt like he had lost a part of himself, a part that had kept him whole during his darkest days. And for Charlie, without the veteran, there was a sense of confusion and abandonment. The emotional reconnection between the veteran and the dog was not just about memory. It was about healing. It was about finding each other again after everything had changed. The veteran's survival in battle had always been partly due to Charlie's unwavering loyalty and instinct. But now, the real battle began. The fight was not against fire or against the outside world. It was a fight for the bond that had once been their shared strength. For Charlie, this reconnection was just as critical. The fire had torn him apart, not just physically, but emotionally. His role as a service dog was defined by duty. But what happens when that duty is no longer recognized? What happens when the one being he trusted most is no longer a source of comfort, but instead a stranger? The stakes are high. For the veteran, the emotional healing from the horrors he has faced is incomplete without the connection to his dog. For Charlie, his role as a companion, a protector, depends on this bond. Without it, who is he? The journey to reawaken the memories, to rebuild the trust, and to find a way back to each other is the challenge they both face now. And neither can fully heal without the other. The veteran sat by the door, his fingers unconsciously drumming on the worn leather collar still clutched in his hands. The sterile white walls of the hospital room seemed to close in around him. Charlie lay on the floor some distance away, his body stretched out but his eyes alert. There was a quiet stillness in the room, broken only by the faint hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of feet from the hallway. Yet despite the calm atmosphere, the veteran could not escape the gnawing feeling in his chest. He had tried everything. Spoken to Charlie, called him by his name, used every familiar gesture and voice command that had once brought instant recognition. But nothing had worked. Charlie was still distant, his eyes lost in a sea of confusion. The connection they once shared seemed like a distant memory. The veteran stood slowly, feeling the ache in his bones, and walked across the room. His hands hovered near Charlie's body, unsure of how to approach the dog now that the bond had frayed. The weight of the collar in his hands felt like an anchor to the past, a painful reminder of what had been lost. "Charlie," the veteran whispered, kneeling beside the dog. He reached out, his fingers brushing the dog's fur once more, his hand trembling. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker, just a brief flicker, of recognition in Charlie's eyes. But it was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared. The dog shifted slightly, curling into itself as if seeking comfort, but there was no obvious response. No tail wag, no leap into the veteran's arms, as there had been so many times before. There was only a soft, questioning gaze. The veteran's heart sank. He stood up, rubbing his face with his hands. It felt like an endless loop of disappointment. He had fought wars and faced impossible odds, but nothing seemed as difficult as this. Every day, every moment spent in this sterile hospital room, the frustration grew. He had sacrificed so much to protect Charlie, and now that sacrifice seemed meaningless. Was the dog lost to him forever? But there was something inside him, a flicker of hope, no matter how small. The veteran knew that Charlie's loyalty had always been unwavering. He had witnessed it countless times before, in the heat of battle, when the dog had never hesitated to rush into danger to save him. Surely somewhere deep inside that same loyalty still existed. It had to. Later that day, the veteran stood in the hospital hallway, staring out the window at the gray sky. He could hear footsteps approaching from behind. He turned to see a nurse walking toward him, holding a small tray with food and water for Charlie. The nurse gave him a small smile, but it felt distant. She seemed more concerned with getting the task done than with the emotional turmoil that had taken over the veteran's life. "How is he doing?" the nurse asked softly. The veteran sighed, glancing down at the tray. "He's not the same, he doesn't recognize me." The nurse nodded as if she had heard similar stories before. It's common for dogs to go through trauma after such an event. The fire, the explosion. It could take time. Time. That was the word that haunted him the most. Time was something that had been taken from both of them. The years spent together, the countless battles fought side by side. And now, time seemed to stretch endlessly, pulling them further apart. The next day, the veteran arrived at the hospital with a familiar whistle on his lips. He had used this particular whistle countless times in the past, whenever they were out on missions, whenever they needed to regroup, whenever Charlie had to find him in the chaos. It was their signal, their bond. The dog's ears twitched. The veteran waited, holding his breath. And then, just like that, the tiniest of movements. Charlie lifted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place the sound. The veteran's heart pounded in his chest as he repeated the whistle, louder this time. Charlie's tail gave a tentative thump on the floor. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. The veteran knelt down beside the dog again, his eyes shining with hope. "Charlie," he whispered again, his voice soft but full of emotion. "It is me. You remember, don't you?" Charlie's gaze flickered toward him. The moment felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. But the bond, however faint, was there. The veteran dared to reach out once more, this time more slowly, allowing the dog the space to decide. Charlie leaned in, just a little, his nose brushing against the veteran's hand. It was a brief moment, but it was enough to send a wave of relief through the veteran. Maybe, just maybe, they were finding their way back to each other. But the progress was slow, too slow for the veteran to feel completely reassured. He spent hours by Charlie's side, talking to him, playing the same games they had played on missions, but Charlie often seemed to respond to others more easily. One of the hospital staff, a young man with a gentle smile, entered the room one afternoon. Charlie perked up immediately, trotting over to him, wagging his tail as if he had known this man all along. The veteran's heart ached with each of those moments. He knew it wasn't intentional, but it felt like a betrayal. The dog, his partner, was slowly bonding with someone else, someone who had not shared the same experiences, who had not been through the same trials. It was a silent blow to the veteran's sense of self, a reminder that the bond they had once shared could be so easily replaced. That evening, as the veteran sat alone in the room, he couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. He had seen Charlie's reaction to the whistle, had felt the brief flicker of recognition, but it wasn't enough. The past, those moments of closeness, of understanding, seemed to drift further away each time. As he sat there, his eyes caught sight of a framed photograph on the bedside table. It was an old picture, one taken years ago when they were both younger and the world had been full of possibilities. The veteran and Charlie stood together, both covered in dirt, their faces tired but proud. They had just returned from a mission, and despite the exhaustion, there was a spark in their eyes, a silent promise to each other that no matter what, they would never be apart. The veteran picked up the photograph, his fingers tracing the edges of the frame. "We can get through this," he whispered to the picture, his voice thick with emotion. "We have to." In the days that followed, the emotional roller coaster continued. There were moments of hope, where Charlie would react to a familiar command or even lean into the veteran's touch, but those moments were always followed by setbacks. Charlie would turn away again, lost in his own world, unsure of who was sitting beside him. But the veteran refused to give up. Every small sign of recognition, every flicker of affection was worth fighting for. He could see the bond struggling to emerge from the ashes, and he knew he had to be patient. Healing was not a linear process. It never had been. He had learned that in the wars they had fought together, and now the war they faced was against time and uncertainty. In the quiet moments, when Charlie lay still, the veteran would speak softly to him, telling stories of their past, of the adventures they had shared, of the times when the world had seemed impossibly dark, yet they had faced it together. He wanted Charlie to remember. He wanted him to find his way back. Through the days of frustration, hope, and setbacks, the veteran began to realize something. Healing would take time, yes. But the bond they shared was not gone. It was simply buried under layers of trauma and confusion, waiting to be uncovered. And as long as he fought for that bond, as long as he kept trying, there was still hope for the future. The emotional intensity continued to build, as the veteran and Charlie both faced the slow journey of rediscovering each other. With each passing day, the bond, though fragile, grew stronger inch by inch until eventually it would be whole once more. The veteran walked into the room, his steps slow but determined. Charlie lay curled up on the floor, his back to the door, as if pretending that the world outside did not exist. The small hospital room had become a sanctuary of sorts, a space where the veteran spent each day trying to rebuild what had been lost. And yet every moment spent here, every touch he offered, seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. The days had blurred together. He had grown accustomed to the quiet isolation that enveloped him, to the ache in his chest that seemed to deepen with each passing day. But today, something felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet tension that hung between them, as if both he and Charlie were standing on the edge of something they could not yet see. The veteran stood for a long moment, watching the dog, unsure of what to do next. He had tried everything: commands, gestures, familiar sounds. He had even brought back the toys they used to play with, but the dog had not reacted. Charlie's eyes, though bright, had remained distant. The bond that once defined their relationship now seemed like a memory, as fragile and intangible as a dream. But something inside the veteran stirred. He had fought wars, survived the unimaginable, but this battle, the one for recognition, was unlike anything he had ever known. It was not a battle fought with guns or strategies, but with patience and hope. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the familiar whistle he had used countless times before, the one that had always caught Charlie's attention, no matter where they were. It had been their signal, their silent understanding, and he had not used it in days. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he feared that it would not work, that the dog would not respond. Or perhaps he feared that the whistle would be another reminder of everything that had changed. But today he could not wait any longer. He raised the whistle to his lips, and with a steadying breath, he blew. The sound was sharp, clear, and precise. It filled the room, cutting through the silence like a call to arms. The veteran held his breath, his eyes fixed on the dog, watching for any sign, any flicker of recognition. For a moment, there was nothing. Charlie remained still, his body relaxed, his gaze distant. The veteran's heart sank. Had he hoped for too much? Was this just another false start, another painful reminder that they were strangers to each other now? But then something changed. Charlie's ears twitched. His head lifted slightly, and for the first time in days, his eyes focused on the veteran. The room seemed to pause as the two of them locked eyes, Charlie's bright, intelligent gaze meeting the veteran's, a silent recognition flickering in the depths of those familiar eyes. And then, without warning, the dog's tail began to wag. It was a slow, tentative movement at first, unsure, as if the dog were testing the waters of their connection. But the veteran's heart quickened as he saw the familiar flick of Charlie's tail, the one that had always been his way of saying, "I'm here, I remember." The veteran dropped to his knees, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could not believe it. It was as if a dam had broken, and the flood of emotions that had been building inside him for days, for weeks, came rushing to the surface. There was relief, yes, but also something deeper, something more primal. It was love. It was the bond they had shared now coming back to life. "Charlie," the veteran whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "you remember me. You remember us." Charlie's tail wagged faster now, the movement more confident, as if he too could not believe what was happening. The dog pushed himself up and staggered toward the veteran, his body shaking with excitement and exhaustion. And then, with a low whine of recognition, he nuzzled the veteran's face, his nose pressed against the veteran's cheek in a gesture so familiar that it brought tears to the veteran's eyes. The veteran wrapped his arms around the dog, pulling him close. He buried his face in Charlie's fur, feeling the warmth of the dog's body against his. It was the same sensation he had felt countless times before, when they had been out on missions, when they had shared a quiet moment of peace amidst the chaos. It was the feeling of coming home. But even as the veteran held Charlie, a small part of him hesitated. There was relief, yes, but there was also a lingering uncertainty. The connection was not as instant or as strong as it had been before. The emotional bond was there, but it was fragile, like something that had been broken and was now slowly being mended. Charlie's recognition, though deep and meaningful, was not a perfect moment. It was not an immediate return to what had once been. There was still time, still healing, still space for the bond to grow. But in that moment, in the quiet, emotional reunion, the veteran understood something profound. The bond had never truly been lost. It had only been buried beneath layers of trauma, of time and distance, and it was now slowly, painfully coming back to life. As the veteran held Charlie close, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the moment. It was a triumph, yes, but it was also a reminder of the work still ahead. The emotional journey was not over. They had both been through too much, seen too much, for things to return to how they had been without effort. But for the first time in what felt like forever, the veteran believed that they would make it. They would heal together. He would not leave Charlie behind, and somehow, Charlie would never leave him. The hospital room felt quieter now, as if the world outside had momentarily stopped turning to make space for something sacred. The veteran sat beside Charlie, who had nestled his head on the veteran's lap. The familiar weight of the dog's body, once a constant presence in his life, now felt like a soothing balm on his tired soul. They were not yet whole, not completely healed, but there was a peace between them, a fragile peace that had taken time to build and would require more time to solidify. The veteran gently ran his fingers through Charlie's fur, the same way he had done countless times before during the long, silent hours spent on patrols, after battles, or in moments of quiet reflection. Every touch was a reminder of the strength of their bond, a bond that had survived through fire, through trauma, through time. But now, it was different. Now, the bond was being rebuilt, piece by piece, through patience, trust, and the quiet understanding that no matter how far apart they had drifted, they would find their way back to each other. Charlie raised his head slightly, looking up at the veteran with eyes that, though still tired, held a softness, a recognition that had been absent for so long. The dog's gaze was filled with understanding, as if he too knew that their journey was far from over, but that they had made significant progress. His tail gave a slight, steady wag, a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. It was a sign of trust, a sign of comfort, a sign of hope. The veteran smiled softly, wiping a tear from his cheek, a tear that had been held back for days, for weeks, for months. "You are here with me, Charlie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I am here with you. We will get through this. We will heal, together." There were still days when the silence felt overwhelming, when the weight of what they had both endured would settle on their shoulders, heavy and unyielding. The veteran still woke in the middle of the night, his heart racing from the nightmares of war, his body tense with the echoes of battles fought long ago. Charlie, too, had his moments of restlessness, moments where his body would twitch, as if still caught in the flames of the fire they had survived. But those moments, though painful, were fewer now. The veteran walked into the room, his steps slow but determined. Charlie lay curled up on the floor, his back to the door, as if pretending that the world outside did not exist. The small hospital room had become a sanctuary of sorts, a space where the veteran spent each day trying to rebuild what had been lost. And yet every moment spent here, every touch he offered, seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. The days had blurred together. He had grown accustomed to the quiet isolation that enveloped him, to the ache in his chest that seemed to deepen with each passing day. But today, something felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air, a quiet tension that hung between them, as if both he and Charlie were standing on the edge of something they could not yet see. The veteran stood for a long moment, watching the dog, unsure of what to do next. He had tried everything: commands, gestures, familiar sounds. He had even brought back the toys they used to play with, but the dog had not reacted. Charlie's eyes, though bright, had remained distant. The bond that once defined their relationship now seemed like a memory, as fragile and intangible as a dream. But something inside the veteran stirred. He had fought wars, survived the unimaginable, but this battle, the one for recognition, was unlike anything he had ever known. It was not a battle fought with guns or strategies, but with patience and hope. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the familiar whistle he had used countless times before. The one that had always caught Charlie's attention, no matter where they were. It had been their signal, their silent understanding, and he had not used it in days. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he feared that it would not work, that the dog would not respond. Or perhaps he feared that the whistle would be another reminder of everything that had changed. But today he could not wait any longer. He raised the whistle to his lips, and with a steadying breath, he blew. The sound was sharp, clear, and precise. It filled the room, cutting through the silence like a call to arms. The veteran held his breath, his eyes fixed on the dog, watching for any sign, any flicker of recognition. For a moment, there was nothing. Charlie remained still, his body relaxed, his gaze distant. The veteran's heart sank. Had he hoped for too much? Was this just another false start, another painful reminder that they were strangers to each other now? But then something changed. Charlie's ears twitched. His head lifted slightly, and for the first time in days, his eyes focused on the veteran. The room seemed to pause as the two of them locked eyes, Charlie's bright, intelligent gaze meeting the veteran's, a silent recognition flickering in the depths of those familiar eyes. And then, without warning, the dog's tail began to wag. It was a slow, tentative movement at first, unsure, as if the dog were testing the waters of their connection. But the veteran's heart quickened as he saw the familiar flick of Charlie's tail, the one that had always been his way of saying, "I'm here, I remember." The veteran dropped to his knees, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could not believe it. It was as if a dam had broken, and the flood of emotions that had been building inside him for days, for weeks, came rushing to the surface. There was relief, yes, but also something deeper, something more primal. It was love.